Hi, and welcome to Hometowns and Heroes. I'm Rebecca Blackwell, and I'm in Sedona, Arizona. I'm here with Mark Stewart. We're the hosts of this show. In this edition, we are going to be introducing you to the namesake of Sedona. How did Sedona get its name? We're going to meet the great-granddaughter, and she's going to tell us all about Sedona, this unique story of how the name came about. It's a very interesting story, and everybody loves Sedona. So let's begin.
Lisa Schnebly Heidinger met us along the beautiful Oak Creek in Sedona, Arizona. Sedona and T.C. Schnebly lived here in 1902. Lisa tells us how Sedona the city got its name from Sedona Schnebly and what Sedona, Arizona was like in the early 1900s and their lives in Sedona.
We're standing on the 80 acres that they lived when they came out from Gorin, Missouri to Oak Creek Canyon in 1901. TC gets help from some other men to build what becomes Schnebly Hill Road up to Flagstaff to sell the produce and things, and would bring down mail for the 5 families that lived here, would bring down salt, sugar, nails, coffee, things like that, sell them out of his front room. Pretty quickly figured out, well, heck, I can be a postmaster. He had to have 2 names suggested, Schnebly Station and Oak Creek Crossing, to which the U.S. Postmaster General in Washington, D.C. scrawls too long in the margin and sends it back. Dorsey Ellsworth, D.E. Schnebly, said, why not name it after Dona? And TC thought, great idea, and Sedona probably thought, I'm a little embarrassed, but okay. And so the new post office and then the new town was named Sedona. When I was a small child, I pictured them coming west in a covered wagon, but I found out that they made most of the trip by train. Back east, when they came out west, had gas lamps and all kinds of modern conveniences. Out here, those 5 families lived in much more rustic conditions. And what it took her every day to bring in the chopped wood for the stove and bring her laundry down here to the creek and kill chickens and collect eggs and cut up fruit and everything else just to put those meals on for the boarders and her family makes me tired. No pioneer woman had it easy, not even in 1901. And it was pioneer in 1901 in this area. Dirt paths to neighbors' houses, very, very different than the town we see today. Best as I can figure, because a little rock dam behind me has washed away. One of the floods 20 years ago took it out. This would have been where TC built said Little Rock Dam to make a still enough pool for Sedona to do her laundry. Their house is right up behind us over there, or was up there. It burned many, many years ago. But all of this was their property, their land, where they grew their orchards, vegetables, fruits, that TC would then take up to Flagstaff to sell on what is now known as Schnebly Hill Road. It didn't get named that until after he built it. He didn't expect it to be called that. And when they, after having left here, moved back here in 1930, he was delighted to know that they had been remembered here. Although, the place being named Sedona, you don't expect that they would have been forgotten here. When she comes out, Carl has come out 6 weeks sooner, and he picks up Sedona and Tad and Pearl in Jerome, where they've been left by the train. And so my grandpa, Tad, was 3, Pearl was 1. Can you imagine spending 4 days on a train with your 1-year-old and your 3-year-old? And then she had Genevieve when they got here. And so then she had the 3 children. Then they moved away for a while. They returned here in 1930. At that point, my daddy, Larry, was their grandson. So Tad is the oldest son of the family. Amanda Miller said there's a first time for any word or name. And Sedona was her creation. It was her only flight of fancy in all those children. And Sedona Schnebly told her daughter, Clara, that she remembers being described as that little bug-eyed Donnie Miller. So I think it would make sense to that little girl to feel like, okay, I'm the least attractive of all the children, but at least I got the prettiest name. When he built the house, and he was paying some men to help him build this house, this 2-story house, and he said to Dona, we'll fill it with boarders till we fill it with children, because he was always a pretty good predictor of what was going to make money. And out here it was peaches, apples, cherries, and a place to stay. And so for the times, $1 a day was not cheap for room and 3 meals. Sedona was a child in Gorin, Missouri. Her parents, Philip and Amanda Miller, were the second richest, most prosperous family in Gorin. So she came from means. They had elocution lessons. She spoke 4 languages. They went to the Gorin Finishing Academy. They were comfortable. But her mother, as far as we can tell, made the name up. And her siblings were Minnie and Edward, and Lily and Noah and Johnny and Pearl and Lola, Edna, when they moved back here, and they lived here from 1930 until they both died in the 50s. She really got to immerse herself in the community. Any of you who are past the stage where your children live with you know that that's when you get to volunteer and have some fun. So she taught Sunday school. She put on the pageants at what we know as the Art Barn. She was, of course, always a prodigious writer and a prodigious correspondent. And she would welcome all the small children and bring them cookies and have them say their Bible verses to her. She was known as Mother Schnebly or Aunt Dona in those years, 1930s to 50s, and was very happy here. Very, very happy here, and partly because TC was so proud of this town. Proud of her, proud of the town. He was the unofficial mayor, ambassador, greeter, Chamber of Commerce. Every day he would go downtown, which is what we think of as uptown Sedona, with a couple of pincushions he had made from century plant stock in his pocket, and meet any strangers. He knew everyone who lived here, so he knew you didn't live here. And he would greet people and say, what do you want to do? What do you want to see? Do you want to go on a hike? Do you want to take a tour? And give these pincushions out to people. I was sent one years later after I did an Arizona Highways article by a woman who had been a bride and met TC on her honeymoon. And he had given her one of those signed pincushions. So Tad and Pearl were the first 2 children. The baby sister Pearl was killed. Tad may have felt responsible as much as Sedona did and never left his mother for long. Always stayed close to her and would go teach schools and come back in the summers, and this was always their permanent address. Sedona, Arizona was their permanent address. So Tad would teach and then come home, get a master's, come back, and that's partly why Larry, my dad, spent so much time with his grandparents. Tad didn't retire until he was in his 70s. His last job was right across the Dry Beaver Creek School, and he would come home to Sedona every night to my grandma, Lucille. And then my dad, Larry, who had been raised up here, ended up in broadcasting, had a wonderful voice, did radio and then television, and then raised us mostly in Tucson. We would come up in the summers to see Tad and Lucille, Grandma and Grandpa. Ellsworth's oldest boy, Larry, was born in 1928, and that's my father. And Larry grew up around Grandma and Grandpa. They weren't famous to him. The town was not famous to him. This is simply where their permanent address was. His father taught on reservation and other small schools, and they always came home here to Sedona to spend every holiday and summers with Grandma and Grandpa. Right behind me is where TC, his grandpa, taught him to swim. This was where they lived. This was home to them and to him. He lived with them for a year with a cousin. He married, from here. I mean, this was Grandma and Grandpa and home to Larry. People always want to know where they can be in Sedona to be where TC and Sedona have been. When you're coming in from I-17 on 179, the first place that they walked is what is now ARABELLA Hotel, because that was the Civilian Conservation Corps camp where TC was caretaker. So it was one of the few places here that was big enough and flat enough to have a camp for CCC men. And TC was there. She would take him as lunch. They lived just up Schnebly Hill Road, a couple of blocks, if there were blocks on Schnebly Hill Road, in what looks like a boxcar if you're coming from the back, kind of a red boxcar. And that was a home for them. So if you want to drive up Schnebly Hill Road, not as far as the first overlook, and come back at it, you'll see that house. It's on the left if you're coming down. This land, obviously, is their 80 acres. And right about where the stone house is now was where their house was. I love going there and thinking about my grandfather celebrating his birthdays right about there. And right here, right under these sycamores, which my father says were standing. They were young trees when she was here doing laundry. So right here by the creek at Los ABRIGADOS, we know they were here. They are buried in the Pioneer Cemetery at the foot of Airport Mesa by the Elks Lodge. The bell that Hank, their son, found in Denver is still at the Wayside Chapel. And if you look up in the little tower, the bell that Hank brought, that T.C. rang for her after she died, that bell is still there.
While we were in Sedona, we visited locations that were related to the life of Sedona and T.C. Schnebly, including the Sedona Library.
I posed for that statue. It was a contest. 8 or 10 artists submitted maquettes of Sedona Schnebly, and she asked me to pose for the one that won. I think they made her look more like her than like me, but who knows. What is now the Sedona Historical Society Museum is where Sedona walked. It was Ruth Jordan's home, and Helen Jordan, Ruth's sister, was a special friend of Sedona's. So when I walk those floors at that museum, I know that Sedona and T.C. walked there because they were great friends of the Jordans, and they all visited back and forth. My whole life, I was fascinated with the fact that my great-grandma was a pioneer, and I always wanted to look like her, wanted those huge dark eyes, and to have my picture taken outside with the red rocks. At that little museum is the portrait of Sedona that her friend Helen Jordan painted, and it always hung above my grandpa's desk. It was his mother's portrait, and it's fun to see that now in the museum and remember when it just hung over grandfather's desk. So I spent my whole life collecting stories of her, from her children, her grandchildren, old newspapers, records, archives, anything I could find. And finally, when I realized there was going to be no journal, I put them all into one book. And there are literally thousands of facts about her and them and their lives in that book, The Journal of Sedona Schnebly, which is on Amazon and at the museum if anybody needs it. And it made me feel closer to them, especially up here, to have written all that into one place. It's nice that that will never be lost now. All those stories are in one place.
Next, we visit the Sedona Heritage Museum for more about the Schneblys and Sedona. On our new edition here in Sedona, we have arrived at the Sedona Heritage Museum. JANEEN TREVILLYAN, who is the historian here, is going to meet with us and tell us a little bit about what you do know about the history of Sedona and bring us up to date on Sedona herself.
So welcome to the Sedona Heritage Museum. We're happy to have you. At the museum here, we tell the general history of the Sedona area from 1876 to present. We start this local modern history, if you will, in 1876 when our first permanent Anglo settler, John James Thompson, arrived here alone. After 2 years, he rode away and brought a wife to the area, and he was 39, she was 16. They had 9 children that all grew to adulthood here, and there are Thompsons who still live in the area. Right after the Thompsons, we had other families come, and we do focus on telling the stories of those first families, the families who came and stayed past 2 generations, and in some cases still have representatives in the area today. When people came to Sedona, some people say, well, did they come for the beauty? You know, it's so beautiful. But, you know, back in the 1870s, people came here because they were looking for a place where they could claim homestead and hopefully feed their family. And if you were looking to do that in the dry state of Arizona, you were looking for a water source. So people came to Oak Creek because it was a year-round water source. Eventually, they hauled water by buckets to their gardens, then they put in irrigation systems, then they put in complicated irrigation systems with flumes and pipelines and reservoirs. And with that, they were able to get into the commercial orcharding business. So here, we're on the property of Walter and Ruth Jordan. They came here in the late 1920s. When Mr. Jordan married in 1931, he built a one-room cabin, and he and his wife and eventually 3 children lived there. In 1937, when her mother came to stay with them, they added on 2 bedrooms and an indoor bathroom. Then in 1947, after World War II, they added on the room we're in and quite a bit more to the house. It is now a 3,000 square foot rock-covered house. And at the time, it was the big house on the hill, the big fruit packing shed, which we'll see later, had a nice smooth floor, and every kid in town came with their roller skates so they could roller skate in the Jordan packing shed. Well, in 1901, energetic young man from Gorham, Missouri named T.C. Schnebly arrived. His brother was already here and was teaching in the first school in Oak Creek Canyon. When he arrived, T.C. took a look at the number of people who were starting to come and also the fact there was no mail service, and he decided there should be a post office. He wrote away to the Postmaster General and submitted a couple of names, but the Postmaster General at that time had a prejudice for one-word postal stops, and so he wrote back and said, send me something simpler. TC's brother said, you know, why don't you submit your wife's name? It's a pretty name and it's short. So Sedona was submitted to the Postmaster General. We got our first postal stop, our first postmaster, and we got our name, Sedona. We're very lucky that relatives of TC and Sedona Schnebly still live in Arizona, and they have been very generous with sharing family history, family photos, and even some family artifacts. So when you visit the museum, we do have a whole room dedicated to tell the story of TC and Sedona. This is one of Sedona's dresses and her jewelry. They had a little girl when they moved here named Pearl. Unfortunately, after about 3 years of being here, little Pearl was drugged to death by her pony in a real tragic accident. Sedona became very depressed after that. The family moved away, but we do have one of the little dresses that belonged to little Pearl. Sedona's son, Ellsworth, was in World War I. We have his World War I uniform on display. The curtains that you might notice when you visit this room that are up in the windows have red embroidery on them. One of them is even signed Donna, which was Sedona's nickname by family. And so when you see the curtains in this room, you will see Sedona Schnebly's actual personal handicraft. When Sedona became ill and was about to pass away, she had been volunteering at her church in Sedona for years and years and years. So the church took all the memorial money for her and purchased a new organ, which is what she wanted. Our Red Rock country has always been attractive for visitors. Even back in the 1860s and 1870s, when we had a military installation down at Fort Verde, those officers and crew would come up here to recreate. It was a little cooler here and they could still fish and go deer hunting. So we've been a visitor destination for well over 100 years. But after the Schneblys came and a few more families started to arrive here, the word kind of got out that this was a beautiful spot. And one of the things that I think really kicked off the whole visitor idea and then the movie making history of Sedona was when Zane Grey arrived in 1918 and rented a cabin in Oak Creek Canyon. There he spent the summer and he wrote a book called, famously, Call of the Canyon. Back in the 1930s, movie crews came here from Zane to film Zane Grey films again. We made Riders of the Purple Sage here. There were also several other movie crews. Even though it was the Great Depression, movie crews were still moving around. We even had a propaganda film made by a German Führer who would become famous later, made in this area. In the 1940s, during World War II, things slowed down in the movie making area just a little bit because of the war, but right after World War II, it took off. Between 1945 and 1950, there were at least 3 movie crews a year in Sedona making Western films. It was a very favorite genre around the country, and during that period of time, every famous studio, every famous movie star came to Sedona during that time. We're talking about John Wayne came more than once, Henry Fonda came 3 times to Sedona to make movies, Glenn Ford, Barbara Stanwyck, Sterling Hayden, Tyrone Power, Rock Hudson, Donna Reed, Joan Crawford made her cult favorite Johnny Guitar here. I mean, Ernest Borgnine, it just goes on and on and on, all the famous movie stars who came to Sedona. Even Elvis Presley came to Sedona in 1967 to make Stay Away Joe, probably his worst film ever, but we're pretty happy that he made it in Sedona.
We were lucky enough about 5 years ago to find out that a piece of movie history, Sedona movie history, still existed, and that was this little telegraph office that we're standing in. In 1946, John Wayne made a movie here called Angel and the Bad Man, and he found this old train station near Flagstaff, and he hauled it down the hill, if you can imagine, to Sedona and put it into his new movie set. After being abandoned, we found it, and we were given it as a gift by the owner, and we picked it up and moved it again, brought it here to the Sedona Heritage Museum. Now we tell the history of the golden age of Western film as made in Sedona. When you visit the museum, you will find in our old telegraph office movie clips from old Sedona-made movies, stories about how the locals made money off the movie crews, all the different sets, all the different movie stars, little quotes and anecdotes about all those people who came here. There are stories of Sedona Schnebly, our namesake, who did laundry and cooking for some of the movie stars. Our county sheriff, who was only part-time at the time, he provided security to the movie crews. And there's every kid and every cowboy in town worked at some point in time as an extra, a wrangler, or some other type of job, movie locator. Maybe they rented their horses and their wagons to the movie crews.
And after you spend some time at the museum, we are on the property of the 5-acre city park. So we have picnic tables, we're pet friendly, where it's a good place for the kids to spend some time and run around. Children 12 and under are free at the museum. We have activities for children, including a dress-up area. And for those of you who like to shop, we have a gift shop. Here at the Sedona Heritage Museum, we're a volunteer organization. We love meeting people. We love having our guests enjoy our facility. So we invite everybody to come to the Heritage Museum and learn about our past. It's very rich, it's very unique, and we work every day as a group of volunteers to preserve the past for the future.
So the next time the road takes you to Sedona, Arizona, enjoy all the wonderful outdoor activities and amaze yourself with God's creations. It's here you'll find highly acclaimed artisans and dining experiences and landscape hotels, all set right among the lifeblood of the desert, Oak Creek. And this is the perfect place to start your journey with a little bug-eyed pioneer girl whose namesake we still hold today, Sedona.